Hello, hello! Gonna be talking about version 3.5 in this video today. Something a little bit more freeform and informal, though I got my notes here, is so I can keep my train of thought going. Okay, so story-wise, I thought this was a really solid introduction to the Shuangfang arc. We have a decent establishing premise surrounding a villain that continues to offer perspective on the general idea of a predetermined end versus the natural evolution of civilization, which has been established since roughly 2.0. This time, Kuro are presenting a more antagonistic approach to the idea. What if the Sentinels are actively hindering us? We assume they protect humanity, but what if they're no more than masterminds watching ants live about their lives in some twisted live farm? We actually have proof that isn't the case with our adventures involving Jue, Imperator, and most recently the Exostrider Lahai Roy. However, we did see this concern echoed by Imperator back in 2.2 and 2.7. Though, if we take a more skeptical view, we know that our windy equine sentinel was completely freed from the restrictions placed on other sentinels, so their self-reflection may have only come after they gained their free will. And Lahai Roy ascended to become a sentinel without undergoing whatever normal programming processes the mech series would otherwise. Though we still have the benefit of doubt in place for Sin. She's definitely not able to execute her role as a sentinel to the fullest extent for now. And Jue definitely demonstrated a care for humanity and Jinshi. So, we got that going for Jue. Next, there were a few things in particular about the scene where Rover gains the power of Electro. First, Shin informs Rover that they were never meant to wield her power and authority. However, Rover is able to break this rule by making a pact with Shin. Starting to sound familiar? By extension, that would mean Rover also should not have inherited Imperator's power. However, Rover also made a pact with them and subsequently gained a resonance with Arrow indirectly via Cardathea and her independent second resonance awakening via Turvin. Second, looking at the fight itself, we can also learn that Sentinel Tech doesn't fight well against other Sentinel Tech. Note how the power of separation and Spectro are ineffective, but Havoc kinda works, since it's derived from a Threnodian source over Thrax and the Dreamless. It's only after gaining the authority from Shin and making the pact, her ability to influence her own creations, that Rover can take down the mech with Yang Yang. All this to say, Threnodian powers affect Sentinels, but other Sentinels are almost unable to harm other Sentinels. Okay, so next up is Mengzhou. When we first got into Shuangfang, what made itself very apparent to me were how all the different factions, internal and external, are playing in our faces, basically. We first got a giant snippet of how the global politics worked back in 3.1 with Luke's segue and explaining how the New Federation, Ashinohara, and all the different nations start playing with each other in Lahai Roy. Now, as we move over to Shuangfang, we see the same thing again, except we see how the internal mechanisms of Huanglang work. They have a non-interference mandate, essentially, between the different regions, essentially hard-locking military presence, trade routes, and all sorts of interactions, while Mingting serves as this grand authority looming from above everything, which we got teasers of back in 2.7 as well, with Cho Yuan's questline. Another faction that cropped up were the Zhojuan Atelier and the Court of Savante. We're very familiar with how the CSC works, but the Zhojuan Atelier is our new parallel internal organization, and it really helps sell how rounded the world is. We have an international organization, but the internal organization has their own rule book, their own plays, their own feels, and it really accentuates how the different ideologies are coming together and fighting each other for, not dominance, but, well, I suppose dominance, honestly. But the main point is that it helps sell that the world is moving in unseen ways and are engaging in different problems that don't necessarily have an answer, a satisfactory answer in brute force, which we've honestly been kind of favoring. Beat up Overthrax, beat up Leviathan, beat up Aleph 1 and with a giant robot. So, But beyond Xuanfeng and the rest of Huanglong, we get to find out that Jinzhou is relatively young. The founding war for Jinzhou was approximately 200 years ago, and both Sentinels, Jue and Xin, partook in it, with Rover fighting alongside Jue during the final battle. Since then, it's been perfectly long enough for a few generations to rise and fall and give Jinzhou a rounded culture and history, but still young enough to not have that fully mature infrastructure, so they're pretty noticeably behind technologically compared to Xuanfeng Hold. They don't have any of the fancy systems or machinery that currently characterize the space. As such, they have to rely on more manual means or classic machinery, but hey. We see this division a little bit more apparently with Yang entry into Xuanfeng itself. She's been training to improve herself and her forte, and that's given her a bit of an edge against the Auto-Puppet Rebellion compared to most of the other Wardens. That's not to say that the Wardens are necessarily incompetent, as evidenced by our short time with Yang Yu and several other members. However, I still am kinda concerned because their societal reliance on the Auto-Puppets has left a, frankly, very fatal blind spot in their preparations once they were taken out of commission or corrupted by the Auto-Puppet Rebellion. Not to mention, each Auto-Puppet is shown to be a lethal force all unto itself, so this is further impressed on us after we finish the main story quests. If we visit Yang in Xianlong Village, we can find her training with some of the Wardens. Her sparring partner remarks that her swordplay is quite good, actually. She's been capable of beating most of the troops. Needless to say, I'm gonna be very invested to see how this turns out, because this is, as I mentioned earlier, just continuing along the mentions of whether or not the civilization should be left alone or be guided, and how Xin is going to respond to that idea, and how Rover is going to contend with that, and who else is with Rover will contend with these revelations and more deeper considerations about their world, Oh, and speaking of divisions and very scary thoughts, the new Federation was explained to have an even greater technological understanding of resonator research compared to much of the world at large. Immediately, I think, does this research beat out Tethys? Currently, I don't think so. However, we are not fully aware of what Tethys is capable of. Though we have a fairly good idea, because Tethys can detect resonators awakening to their power, and if that resonance ability is useful to the Black Shores. So, I'm gonna say no. I don't think so. The next question would be, why do new Federationists care so much about resonator research when we know they 1000% ostracize them and probably treat them worse than second-class or third-class citizens? And the main points I draw from this are the Fraxidus, who are one of, if not the biggest sponsor in the entire region, and we know they care about resonator research. So does this mean that the new Federation only keeps them around as purely specimens? Oh gosh. Or are they there just by some twisted sense of oppressive obligation? Ugh. I mean, we're gonna find out sooner than later, but that sounds like an awful place to live. Okay, so let's move on to something a little bit more neutral. While we're still on the topic of resonators, we find out from Sui Sui during the story that resonators do not often live to 200 years of age, which Muyu is reportedly to be at least 200 years. Originally, I was under the impression that resonators would essentially live to the maximum extent of a human life, so about 120 years, give or take, and any further lifespan would suggest that there are some special circumstances surrounding them, and only continues to hammer in how Rover is very abnormal in living well over 10,000 years, apparently. Oh, and one more thing that doesn't quite fit anywhere in the above talk that I just yapped for. It's that Rover doesn't think Frolova is active in this region because of the events of 2.5 and what they learned about her, and the current state of the corrupted autopuppets. Rover knows that the autopuppets are imbued with the twisted negative emotions of the dead and forced to survive on, much like the Gui Shu simulations in 1.3. I suspect this desecration of the dead to be very much against Frolova's underlying code of conduct, so her goading or convincing Muyu to do such a thing would very much be abhorrent to her. Anyway, I have talked long enough. Thank you for listening if you've made it this far. Have a great day.